If you love the look of ink blending, but you don't have the time or you're still practicing and you haven't quite perfected your skills yet, today's video is for you. I've got tips for what I'm calling lazy ink blending. How to do it, where to do it, why to do it, and when to do it. To be honest, this topic came to me by accident. I was making some cards for the Crafty Meraki March release video hop, and I started by creating a mini slim card base, which is 6 1/4 by 3.5 inches. I wanted a fresh green color all over it, and I masked off the back of the card with some 2-inch post-it tape just past the fold, and I got out my grass skirt ink and a blending brush. I started blending, but my ink pad was a little dry, and I could see it was just going to take forever, which seemed dumb since I knew I was going to add a mini slim die cut over top. So I grabbed the ink pad and I just started pressing it onto the card base. I was careful not to move the card at all because I don't want any green ink on the inside of the card front. And don't forget, my ink pad was a little dry, and that became very apparent with how hard I had to press and how often I had to go over some of the areas. And it really looked like a bit of a hot mess. But there are 2 good reasons why I didn't stress about it. Number 1, these inks smooth out a lot as they dry. Number 2, I knew I would be covering a good part of it with that die cut later on. Now I only used 1 color here, but later on I'm going to use 3, so stick around to see how it works with more than 1 color. Next, I'm ink blending some green cardstock for some leaves, and I started with my now refilled grass skirt ink and also some Meraki. I swiped it this time rather than pouncing it, and that will give me some texture as well as variation in my colors. Then I used this panel to cut some tulip leaves from the Athena Flora die set. I did this a couple of times since I'll be using these tulips on all my cards. For the tulips themselves, the die cuts 5 different flowers at a time, and I've cut quite a few of them. I could have colored the cardstock first like I did for the leaves, but I wanted to show you another lazy ink blending idea. Rather than keeping lots of colored cardstock and having to organize and store all the scraps, I usually just cut my die cuts from scraps of white cardstock and use my inks to color them. And with small pieces like this, I can press them into the ink pad, push down on one side so the other side rises up a little and I can grab it. You could also use tweezers if you want, but be careful not to damage your ink pad, especially if it's foam. You can also put the die cuts down on your work surface and press the ink pad down on top. This can allow you to do several at once. I chose 5 different base colors for my tulips and did a few in each shade. Now these look pretty, but I want to add a bit of dimension to them, so for each color I used a shade darker and a finger dauber to add a little blending to the bottom edges. Because the first color is still damp, the darker shades will blend easily and you don't need to be very careful about your blending. I wouldn't call this lazy ink blending, but it's certainly not the full-on, proper, tricky type either. As my leaves dried, I lost some of the variation between the 2 greens, so I went back in with some aquatini in the dauber to add some dimension on one side. Now here's that green card front, and you can see that it's really smoothed out quite a bit. It's not perfect, but remember the plan is to add a die cut over it. I cut the round-the-block mini slim cover plate from the white cardstock, popped out the circles, which I'll keep in the pocket with the die for another project. For my sentiment, I used the Hello Shadow word die. This one cuts a shadow at the same time and has another separate stitch shadow die. I used just the actual word, since this card is quite narrow and I'll have to put it on a bit of a slant to fit it on once I've stacked up 3 layers of black cardstock. Before I glued it down though, I arranged some of my tulips and leaves around the card so I could have some under the sentiment if I wanted to. I created 3 groupings of tulips, mixing the colors and adding some leaves. To finish the card, I added a little sunshine word from the new Spring Bloom stamp set, and I stamped it on one of my leftover frame-worthy frames and then snipped it out to create a stitched sentiment strip. I popped it up under the Hello die cut and added some of the new peridot pearls. Before we move on, be sure to take a close look at this card. There is not one area where proper ink blending would have made this card look any better, and that's what makes this quick technique so useful. My next card is going to take advantage of that 1 tulip die that cuts 5 at a time. I started by cutting the 2 largest frames from the mini slim frame-worthy set from white cardstock. Please don't ask me why I didn't cut the tulips from the centerpiece at the same time, because I just don't know. It would have saved me 1 pass through my die cutting machine. I looked through my tulip pile to see if I still had tulips to fit in all 5 colors, and I did. So then I got to work on the frames. I grabbed 3 colors of green ink this time and 3 sponge daubers, and I literally just pressed each one down, trying to ensure that they overlapped as I went along. I didn't worry about measuring between them or whether I had the same number of each shade. I just kept going, and with the last color, made sure that there was no white space left on the frame. Then I moved on and did the larger frame. This video is part of a hop to celebrate the latest Crafty Meraki release, which includes these tulip dies and the Lila dies that you'll see in a moment, as well as lots of other spring-themed stamps, dies, and embellishments. When you're finished watching here, you can use the link below in the description to hop to the next video. All the hop details are also in the description, as well as on my blog. Here are my frames and tulips. The greens are still pretty separate and not blending very smoothly. I think that adding that Mardi Gras in, which is quite a blue-green, made a big difference. The frames are still wet, and as they dry, they'll fade back, but if you're worried that your inks aren't blending enough, just grab some shimmer spray and give your pieces a spritz. This will soften the blend, add some sparkle, plus give the cardstock an almost velvety texture. To finish this card, I stamped a small sentiment in the bottom corner, and I added some pearls next to it. Okay, now here is my most daring use of lazy ink blending. Even I wasn't convinced it was going to work, but I wanted to test it out. I started with 3 blue inks and I pressed them onto my birthday Slimline tag. Darkest at the bottom, medium in the middle, and lightest at the top. I overlapped them to try and get a bit of a blend, but really at this stage, I can't say it's blending at all. If I wanted to use this background on its own, this would be the right time for proper ink blending. But again, it's going to smooth out and dry, and again, I'm going to be using some camouflage, and the recipient will never know that I didn't spend hours working back and forth to get a perfect gradient. And here's my camouflage. It's another tag, and I'm going to cut it with the Slimline plaid die to give me a plaid overlay. I positioned the tag onto the plaid die carefully, trying to make sure it was centered so it will have a symmetrical look, and then I ran it through my die cutting machine. Then I got out my liquid glue and I settled in for a long winter's night. You could use an adhesive sheet, which would turn this almost into a sticker, but the thought of dealing with all those sticky little offcuts led me to prefer liquid glue in this case, even though it took me a few minutes. Now I've got the 2 tags glued together, and already my lazy blending is looking a million times better. But there's still a pretty harsh line between the light and mid-tone, I know. But don't worry, my bouquet is going to be there and you'll never notice. I'm adding in some of these Lila Flora flowers to my bouquet. I've pressed some sea glass ink onto the cardstock for the leaves, and I've left the flowers white. I'm not sure if these are bluebells or lilies of the valley or maybe even something else entirely, but I thought some more white would be nice here. Again, I added a little dimension to these tiny blossoms, this time with some Tranquil ink, which is a soft bluish gray. I put liquid glue onto the stems and added the little flowers, and now I'm ready to arrange. And arranging flowers is not something I'm very good at, and it takes me a very long time, so I've left most of that out of the video. But now you can see that no one is ever going to guess that I used lazy ink blending for that background. I want to show you how I added the sentiment with that big lumpy pile of stems in the center. I cut Happy from gold cardstock, and then I cut it 4 times from white. I cut out the first P from the 4 white die cuts, and I layered up the 2 ends so that the gold P is almost like a bridge over the flower stems, and the word lies pretty level. You could use this tag on a card, but I added a white satin ribbon bow, and I can just picture how pretty this is going to be attached to a gift. I also added some ivory pearls for a little shimmer. Lazy ink blending is not always the right technique, but when it's a small area or it's a big area that's going to be partially hidden by layers, it's great to have a quick alternative. You can save your proper ink blending for the times when it will have the most impact. And now it's time to use the link in the description below to hop to the next video. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time!